The sun had barely risen over the Atlantic when the world's gaze fixed itself upon the unmistakable silhouette of American power. To ordinary eyes, it was just another dawn, but for those who watched closely, the sight was enough to steal breath from lungs. The U.S. Carrier Strike Group moved across the ocean like a floating city, colossal and unstoppable, its steel decks brimming with warplanes glinting like blades in the light. F-35s lined up like vultures on the flight deck, engines growling as if impatient for release. Ospreys folded neatly, waiting like predators with clipped wings. Alongside the giant carrier, destroyers and cruisers moved with precision, their sleek hulls cutting through the waves in perfect synchronization. To many, it was awe-inspiring, a vision of dominance that had cowed rivals for decades. But to others, especially those watching from the hidden corners of the world, it was not just a display of might, it was a target waiting to be struck. In underground bunkers, screens lit up with live feeds of the fleet, commanders whispering that the age of untouchable America was finally fraying. The arrogance of power, the assumption of safety, had made the Colossus complacent. Every empire carries within itself the seeds of its undoing, and today those seeds stirred. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen weapons were being prepared. Weapons designed not to intimidate but to cripple. For now, though, the world only stared in silence. Fishermen along the Caribbean coast pointed at the formation, their children wide-eyed at the thunder of jets overhead. Reporters framed shots with trembling hands, aware they were documenting the opening chapter of something that would be studied in history books. And leaders, both allies and enemies, leaned forward in their chairs, eyes narrowing as the image of American power filled their screens. None could look away. The stage was set, the audience captive, and the first act promised a spectacle unlike any before. When the world watched, someone else was already moving in the quiet places between headlines. In a windowless room lit by the phosphor glow of monitors, a ragged network of operators, ex-intelligence officers, and privateers stitched together. A plan not to destroy but to unmask, to expose vulnerability and shame a superpower into retreat. They called themselves a consortium, but to others they were a ghost army, nameless, stateless, and patient. Their first wins would be theater, a carefully timed leak of satellite imagery showing U.S. supply routes, counterfeit communications that sowed confusion in a distant port, a viral clip that made it appear a convoy had abandoned its humanitarian cargo. Each act was calibrated to produce outrage, not casualties, to make allies question commitments, to feed domestic opponents who would shout overreach and demand distance. The leader of the consortium watched the carrier's silhouette on a grainy live feed and smiled, with the old arrogance of anyone who understands perception is often more powerful than ordnance. They moved through proxies, shell companies buying imagery, anonymous accounts amplifying the right clips. Sympathetic journalists fed fragments that suggested a pattern. In back channels, diplomats whispered that this was hybrid warfare, a cocktail of psyops, economic pressure, and targeted embarrassment, designed to erode the political will that supported forward deployments. Washington's response was a visible tightening. Rules of engagement re-emphasized, patrols rerouted, public affairs teams drafted soothing statements. But the consortium had already seeded doubt. In state legislatures and editorial rooms far from the sea, activists and pundits quoted the fake footage as proof of mismanagement. Stock tickers crawled as insurers worried about naval logistics liability. The power of a narrative is that it can skew decisions at every level. A misinformed electorate might force politicians to demand withdrawal or restraint. Yet the consortium's architects knew their limits. They avoided bloodshed and detailed instructions for attack. They preferred exposure and embarrassment to mass violence. Their goal was strategic, entropy, wear down the social and political consensus that allowed the U.S. military to operate unchallenged. In that, they were frighteningly effective. As diplomats argued about sanctions and investigation teams compiled logs, the public debate churned hotter. The carrier remained, a target in the minds of many, not because of any one strike, but because the narrative had redefined what risk meant. In a modern era of information, perception could produce outcomes. Physical weapons often could not. The consortium had weaponized disbelief itself, and that weapon was already changing the shape of the standoff. As narrative spread, another front opened where shadows meet steel, the cyber corridors. The consortium did not try to jam a missile or reroute a flight. Instead, they mounted precision, disruptions that were noisy and non-lethal but consequential, temporary, outages to logistics portals, spoofed maintenance alerts that delayed replenishment, targeted denial of service pulses that clogged administrative channels. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as technical issues, yet repeated, often enough to fray nerves and shipment timetables. Importantly, they avoided providing operational instructions that would actually arm anyone to replicate an attack. Their job was to unsettle, not to instruct. Washington's cyber teams fought back with classification walls and counterintelligence sweeps. Private security firms with neon-bright logos competed for contracts, their analysts tracing breadcrumbs across jurisdictional mazes. Allies were tapped for cooperation. Benign data-sharing agreements suddenly acquired an urgency that broke months of diplomatic caution. In boardrooms and secure annexes, engineers talked about resilience and redundancy. In lay terms, they tried to make uncertainty manageable. On the decks of ships at sea, sailors felt the ripple effects, port calls delayed, supplies rerouted, a sense that the machinery of power was becoming brittle under 1,000 micro-attacks. Meanwhile, visible escalation played out in bay and sky. Patrols increased, but their visibility had the dual effect of deterring some actors while feeding the consortium's narrative. Photos of overflights and close escorts became fodder for critics at home. The synergy between cyber, disruption, and narrative warfare showed its power when a humanitarian convoy missed a slot because of a falsified clearance, producing an embarrassing news cycle that critics portrayed as evidence of incompetence. The U.S. military's response balanced firmness with caution, repair, reassure, and avoid a headline that might be misconstrued as aggressive. High above, pilots felt the weight of political calculus pressing down on practical choices. Commanders were increasingly required to think like diplomats, and diplomats had to act like emergency managers. That blurred boundary was the consortium's battlefield. It turned logistical frustration into political leverage, and in doing so, redefined what an attack could look like in the 21st century. Pressure mounted until the seams stretched thin. Policymakers, sensing domestic unease, called for restraint and review. Military commanders, sworn to protect, bristled at limits that could hand strategic advantage to an adversary. The consortium, watching the tension it had sown, prepared its final theatrical gambit, not a kinetic strike, but an exposure designed to force a public reckoning. In a coordinated release, they published a cache of documents and video that showed missteps, procurement failures, and a chain of errors that tied together in a way too embarrassing for simple denial. The material was curated to provoke outrage, without crossing into fabrication of life-or-death operations. It leaned on administrative failures, embarrassing memos, and redacted but revealing timelines. The reaction was instantaneous. Headlines screamed about mismanagement at the highest levels. Congressional hearings were demanded. Allies called for audits and reassurances. The Pentagon, used to operational criticism, now faced a political storm that touched procurement, ethics, and morale. On the ground, sailors and airmen watched as public support crested and ebbed, aware that strategy, at its core, relies on the political will of a populace willing to sustain risk. The consortium did not celebrate destruction. It celebrated constraint. Enforcing an introspective convulsion, they hoped to shrink the space where the U.S. could project power with confidence. But power rarely yields quietly. Behind closed doors, the U.S. retooled. A new cadre of resilience officers, information managers, and hybrid task strategists convened to patch the reputational damage and harden vulnerabilities. Training pivoted to encompass not just seamanship and marksmanship, but also narrative discipline and rapid response to disinformation. Allies began to rebuild trust with joint transparency, measures, and enhanced oversight. The carrier still steamed, large and dangerous, but the calculus around it had shifted. The consortium had not toppled the Colossus. Instead, they had shown that the Colossus could be nudged, prodded, and reframed. Whether that would mean less forward presence, more careful diplomacy, or simply a change in methods remained to be seen. For now, both sides had learned something crucial. In an age where stories travel faster than ships, the battle for perception can be as consequential as any missile. But how the world will tell the story afterward